Hi everybody. So let's see the practical project we are going to develop in the next couple of lessons. So the coding is in the background and this is the coding you will be learning. And when you run this app, you will see a dynamic user interface generated. What I mean by a dynamic user interface is, let's say if the user select a question like what is your gender, then it dynamically generates the user interface. And if the user select a choice and click next, it will dynamically figure out what the choice and store it. Let's say it stores it. And let's say if you select another question like what are the banks you are dealing with, then it shows a different set of user interfaces generated dynamically where the user can select, let's say, the options and click next, and then those options are again written or saved for future reference. And let's say if the user select what is your name, then it dynamically generates the UI. And let's say the user can type something from the keyboard and click next, and then that value is stored once again. So this practical will show you how to develop a dynamic user interface and how to access the dynamic user interface elements dynamically. When I say access dynamically, because when you click the next button, you don't know whether it can be a checkbox list or it can be radio buttons or it can be something else. So that is what I mean. When you click the next button, you will learn how to dynamically figure it out, whether it's a checkbox or radio buttons and likewise. So this is a very simple exercise, but it's very powerful and it will give you advanced knowledge about dynamic user interface developments. So we are very excited to develop this app, and now let's go and develop this app. Hi everyone. So welcome to Dynamic UI Simple Example Part 5. This is Part 5, so make sure you look at the previous parts before you look at this lesson. We'll be using these tools for this lecture, and make sure you have followed these prerequisites before you start this lecture. So these are the points you will be learning in this practical lecture. For you to understand what are these points, look at our previous parts of this lesson so that you will understand what are these. And now let's continue the practical demonstration and let's continue finishing this app, developing this app. So this is the web application we have developed so far, where we can type some name, and when we click next, it's dynamically finding what the component, and it figures out what the content we have typed or selected. So now we have done it only for the text box. So now in this lesson we are going to do it for checkboxes to dynamically figure out. So if user selected these banks and click next, I would like to display the names of the banks here, right? Okay, so now let's continue to apply this for the checkboxes and for the radio button. So if it's a checkbox, first of all, like we did for the, if it's a checkbox, first of all, like we did for the text box, we have to find the control from the placeholder. So what you do is same command. You will say placeholder 1 find control. The control type now you know is the ID. So you have to make sure that when you add the component, see over here, you have to, like you gave the ID, you have to, just before you add to the in the dynamic UI generation, just before you add the checkbox, you have to make sure that you give IDs, right? And same for the radio button. So let's give a ID for the checkbox, and because we have to do the same thing for the radio button, after this we will also give a ID for the radio button just before you add it to the placeholder. And why we give this ID, so that we can now find it later when we click on the button. So now in the button click, when you access the control type, you will get the ID if it's a checkbox currently being selected by the user, checkbox question. You'll get the ID as checkbox 1. If you go down, like, the ID will be checkbox list 1, and because you are placing, okay, and then you have to place that ID like you did it for the text box. Text as a control type, you have to place the text box 1.id. Then similarly, over here as the view state control type, you will be placing checkbox list 1 ID, and if it's radio button type question, you will be putting the radio button list 1, that object, whatever that object's ID over here as the view state control type. So why you do that is, from the button click, when you access the control type, you are getting the ID. So in the button click, when you get the control type, you are getting the ID, so that you can straight away pass it, and if it's a checkbox, if it's, so it's not checkbox, then it should be the ID, right? Like text box 1. So now you will check, okay, if it is checkbox list 1. So in the button click, you are checking if this view state control type, if the value is checkbox list 1. Then if it is radio button, you want to see if the ID is, if the view state control type, is it your radio button list 1. If it's checkbox list 1, you will convert it into a checkbox, right? So this is how you dynamically find the component. And then you need to find, when the button is clicked, you need to find, okay, from this checkbox list, what checkboxes are selected by the user, by the client. So for that, you have to put a loop and traverse this checkbox list and see if each individual checkbox is selected. So for that, you have to write this code. So this code traverses the checkbox, gets all the items from the checkbox list, and if each item is selected, then of that item, the text, whatever the text of that checkbox, you will be getting it, and you will be appending it to the lbl answer.text. But that's what you are telling here. lbl answer value dot text plus equals. So this plus equals means, if it's confusing for you, this means get the current value. This means if I put it over here like this, so that is what it means. So if that item is selected, take the current value of the label text to that, put a comma and add that text. So this is the same thing. If I write it in a shortcut way, this is the same thing. Instead of this, you can shortcut the same thing, you say plus equal. So what you are appending that text to this label, right? Awesome. So now let's run and see whether this works for the checkbox. So now we know it works for the text box anyhow. It says David John. Now if I select what banks are you dealing with, let's say ANZ and Westpac, and if I click next, now it says ANZ and Westpac. It also says button clicked. I can remove it, but it works, ANZ and Westpac. So if I select Suncorp, if I click next, of course now it's let's do like this. So if I select, if I click the text box and if I say David John and click next, and now if I come back and let's say if I select Westpac and Suncorp and click next, it says Westpac and Suncorp. So now it works for the text box. Let's do the same thing for the radio button as well, and for the button click, maybe now I can remove this. I don't need this because now I'm giving the real values selected by the user. Now the same thing has to be done for the radio button as well. So what you have to do is similar to what you did for the text box and for the checkbox you have to find it from the placeholder using whatever the view state value you got as a control type. If it's radio button list 1, then you search, because you know it's a radio button now. Once you get the radio buttons, you don't know which item has been selected by the user, so you have to go through, you have to traverse the radio button, all the items, and then you have to see if user has selected any item. If so, you do the same thing, you get the text and append it. So now if I run this for the radio buttons, you will see, okay, if I just do it for text box just to start with, okay, David Jones, and if I now select gender, if I select radio button, let's say male, and click next, now it says male, it's working, right? It says radio button selected as well, but let's come back and let's come back, gender female, and click next, it selects. So now it's dynamically finding the control and getting the value. It says radio button selected, you can take it away, that part. So now you don't need this, right? So you can just comment this checkbox selected, and also you can just comment this radio button. We had them earlier, but now we have the app completed, we don't need this as well, right? So now if I let's look at this to see what else to be done. So now if we run this web application and look at the complete overall look at it, so now it's generating dynamic UI. Whenever I select the question, it generates, and whenever I select a question, it changes the UI and click next. It now, when I click next, it access whatever the component dynamically, and it finds what has been selected or typed by the user. So ANZ, Commonwealth, Westpac. So if I click next, okay, ANZ, Commonwealth, Westpac. Then if I click gender, let's say female, for example, next, that also gets added. So now we successfully completed the dynamic UI, simple example. So the next step is to make this a complete app. But by now you learn the significant concepts. So the conclusion is, now you learn this entire bullet point list. So you learn about dynamic UI, how to create, how to add components dynamically, and how to find them dynamically, and the use of placeholders and auto post back, and the view state. So we use these practical references for this app. And what's next? So what's next? What's going to be next is, now we have the dynamic UI generation simple exercise, but now the next step is to make this a complete project connecting to a database. So the next lesson will be connecting this to a database, and instead of selecting questions from here, to get these questions also from the database. So the project is going to be a survey project. Survey is like if you have done surveys on the internet, it's asked questions, right? So then you give some answers. So the next lesson is going to be a complete project A to Z, where you will develop a survey application where you read these questions also from the database, and whenever you add some new question to the database, it will automatically populate here, and when you click next, it will load the next question rather than you have to select it from a drop down. But in that next project, when you click next, it will load the next question from the database, and whatever the current question values selected by the user will be saved in the database, right? So it's going to be a complete survey type of a project. So we are very excited to see you in that project. So see you all in that next lesson, where we develop a complete database application connecting this and completely doing a advanced project which you can use for various, your day-to-day projects or whatever knowledge gaining. So we'll be doing a complete data-driven app with connecting to the database and then using this knowledge of dynamic UI developments. So we are very excited once again to see you in that next lesson, and see you all in the next lesson.